We talked with Professor Monte Brown of the Philosophy Department here at St. Anselm College about his new book, Reason, Revelation, and Metaphysics. In this segment, he talks about the Transcendental Analogies and the thesis of his new book. The subtitle of the book is the Transcendental Analogies. Can you tell us what those are and how they fit into the
Yes,
book?
well, it kind of melds together two big metaphysical topics, the transcendentals and analogy. So the transcendentals are those characteristics that apparently can be, at least seem to be, applicable to all things, including mysteriously God, which is an interesting relationship. So being, unity, truth, goodness, and beauty. Those are the basic ones. I mean, some people add one or two others, but those are the ones that I think are most compelling. And so the question is, if they belong to all things can say to be, to exist, and to be one, and to be true, good, and beautiful, but slightly different ways, then that raises questions for us. So the traditional proof for the existence of God coming out of Plato, it's in Aristotle, it's Aquinas' fourth way, it's in Augustine, it's in Anselm. It's this idea if they're more or less good or beautiful or true or things that exist more or less, there must be some kind of ultimate standard. That's how we get the notion of God. But then what's the relationship between God and these transcendental qualities? And this is where the question of analogy comes in. Because if we talk about God and creatures, we're not going to talk about them exactly the same way, univocal way, but they are related. Otherwise we couldn't argue from creatures to the Creator. So we have to do it in some kind of analogical way, particularly when we're talking about these fundamental goods, the good of the transcendentals. Aquinas will say, by analogy, and here he follows Aristotle, that in things that are related analogically, one of them is the prime meaning. Here he's following Aristotle. Aristotle gives this example of healthy. You know, we can talk about an animal being healthy, medicine being healthy, and urine being healthy, but there's a prime meaning that enters into the definitions of the others. So if we want to know of those three things, what's the most important thing to understand? It's what a healthy animal is, because that's why we want this medicine, because it makes the animal healthy, and the urine is a sign of that. So this idea of a prime analogy, it seems to me to be the fundamental, or the most interesting at least, idea of analogy. There are different ones too that people have talked about, but I think that's really fascinating. And when Aquinas talks about these transcendentals, he's going to argue that the prime analogy is God. So if we're talking about goodness, it exists most perfectly in God, and most really in God, and in a secondary way in creatures. This raises an interesting question for philosophy. Aquinas starts off, his first question to assume is about faith and reason, clearly indicating that we have to have faith and all that. But then he basically takes the realm of philosophy, the way of philosophy for a while. But here's one of the difficulties, tricky passages, is that he says, if we're talking about the relationship between God and creatures, which is what analogy is about, then creatures are really related to God because they depend on God, but God is not really related to creatures. So if, as Aquinas says, the prime analogate for the transcendentals is God, but we don't know anything about God by reason, then how is that going to help us understand the world? This is where I think the idea of revelation comes in.